So when I was planning out all of the things that I thought I would need for what basically amounts to 40 days in Arizona, I was wondering whether I would actually need the stand for this microphone. And I was like, I probably don't need it. I don't think, just because like how many times am I actually going to have the opportunity to have a table set up? So, so I'm 0 for 1 on this trip so far. I also forgot the pop filter. I hope it doesn't make the audio any worse than it already is. I knew I was gonna forget something at some point, so we're off to a great start. And speaking of a great start, it took me 4 hours from the time I landed to the time I got in this hotel room because without getting into the details, of which there are many, it took me a long time to get my rental car. And it wasn't just a long line, it wasn't just any hiccups. The entirety of Hertz, like globally, like was just shut down. Like something, yeah, like all their communication systems were off. It shut down twice in the 2.5, 3 hours that it took me to get my car. And even when I did get my car, it took me about another 30 minutes from the time that I turned the key into the ignition. It was probably more like 45, in all honesty. So I am very happy that now I can just talk Giants baseball. As most of you know, today is the day that pitchers and catchers report for the San Francisco Giants, and tomorrow is the first day of media availability. So with pitchers and catchers set to report and position players set to trickle in at some point in the coming days as well, let's get into some of the things that I'll be watching out for over the entirety of spring training, and kind of a, not really a disclaimer, but just more of a note. The things that I'll be watching out during spring training are pretty different than what I'll be watching for in the regular season. And kind of what I mean by that is, for example, what I'll be watching in the regular season, at least putting really an emphasis on, is how does Jung-Hoo Lee look? How is that tandem of Wilmer Flores and LaMonte Wade Jr., specifically Flores, given some of the injuries that he had to deal with? How is Willy Adames when he starts playing home games in Oracle Park opposed to Miller Park? I'm not calling it American Family Field. It's just weird. Those are the types of things that I'll be watching for and kind of keeping an eye on when the actual game starts. But as far as our purposes today, there's other areas, more kind of subtle, nuanced areas that I want to focus on as far as spring training in particular pertains. And I think the place to start is honestly with the player to watch of spring training, who is Marco Luciano. Now, we don't have to get into the entirety of what happened last year. We all know that kind of going into spring training, he was expected to be the Giants starting shortstop. They bring in Nick Ahmed late. Nick Ahmed ends up being the shortstop for a minute. Tyler Fitzgerald comes in down the stretch, ends up being the true starting shortstop in a sense. And Luciano kind of just never gets that extended run. When he did play, it wasn't great. I think the numbers off top is he had -3 defensive runs saved in 60 innings at shortstop. I want to say it was 6 errors or 5 errors in 60 innings. It wasn't great defensively. It wasn't great offensively. There was the whole thing with after Jorge Soler got traded, Luciano was going to be the full-time DH. That never happened. Basically, it was a bad year. And so he kind of comes into spring training this year in a very different spot compared to last year. The question is no longer, how is Marco Luciano going to do as the Giants starting shortstop? The question now becomes, is Marco Luciano going to make the opening day roster, period? And we honestly just don't know. That's going to be one of the main position battles that we're going to be looking out for over the entirety of spring training. And the added wrinkle into that is that Luciano is no longer a shortstop. He's not even a second baseman. He is now an outfielder, and it appears that he's primarily going to be playing those corner positions, although I am curious to see if they do have him play out in center field at some point. And speaking of Luciano, speaking of the outfield, speaking of the bench generally speaking, this is going to be one of the main positional battles that I'll be keeping an eye on during spring training between Luciano, Luis Matos, and Grant McCray. Technically, Gerard Encarnacion is in the mix, but he's kind of in his own little role of the bat first, corner outfielder slash first baseman slash designated hitter. This is all to say I think Encarnacion has a little more security than those other 3 outfielders just because he's more of that bat first archetype and has a lot of power, which if you're going to have somebody coming off the bench, you might as well have somebody with a lot of pop. But when it comes to Luciano and McRae and Matos, I think more than any other specific position, that being the fourth outfielder position, that one is probably going to come down to performance the most. And there is intrigue with all three of them. Luciano, of course, how does he fare in the outfield? With Matos, does he make a step forward defensively? Because we saw that little spurt last year where it was basically the week of Matos. With McRae, is he able to slice down the strikeouts? Is he able to just put the ball in play a lot more? Because when he does put the ball in play, he has the capacity to make things happen. Moving on from there, another thing I'm going to be very interested in, with kind of a caveat of do we have the data, is going to be Justin Verlander, and specifically his underlying metrics. If you haven't watched the video breakdown I did on Justin Verlander, go watch that after this one. Watch this one till its completion, and then go watch that one afterwards. But one of the things that I brought up is that his velocity was his lowest since, I believe, 2014 or 2015, and his fastball spin rate was the lowest of his career in the pitch tracking era. I believe his slider spin rate was also either the lowest of his career or one of the lowest marks of his career. By Stuff Plus, he's still graded out pretty well, but just compared to where he's been, those numbers were down, and those are the things that I'm going to want to try to keep an eye on. That being said, one of the unfortunate things about the Giants is that they're only going to have 14 games played in ballparks that have StatCast capabilities. So if we go on like game day, we're probably going to be able to see at least pure velocity, which velocity you kind of take with a grain of salt in spring training, especially with someone like Verlander. But my personal hope is that Verlander makes starts on the days that StatCast is available, because then we can really dig into the numbers and see what his spin rate is on all of his pitches. And so we're not really going to get a complete idea of Verlander's stuff profile until the season, maybe 5 starts into the season, which is a bit unfortunate, but that's just kind of the whole thing with, StatCast not being available in every ballpark thus far. And kind of a related side note to that, I do want to say that generally speaking, as we get into spring training, as we get into games, one of the things that I always like to keep an eye out for is, velocity spikes, velocity drops, pitch usage, if somebody's using a different pitch period. Spring training is always a gold mine as far as, seeing the pitchers that actually, added a different pitch or maybe subtracted a pitch and are really refining things. And on the subject of velocity, I'm going to be very curious where Kyle Harrison's velocity sits at during spring training as well. Same thing with Jordan Hicks. I'm kind of curious to see how they both go about it. But with Harrison in particular, when he made his major league debut, he was more so sitting in the mid 90s, not quite in the mid to high 90s, but he would occasionally ramp it up and hit 96, 97, this being in 2023. But I believe the stat that I dug up is that in 2024, not only was his average velocity down, but I don't think he threw a single pitch over 96 miles an hour, and he for sure did not throw a single pitch over 97 miles per hour. Now, that's probably due in part to him realizing he's got a full season workload ahead. He's no longer making his debut. He doesn't have that, extra spike of velocity. It could be due to a lot of factors, but I'm going to be very curious to see what that's looking like in spring training. And again, the caveat that you should take spring training velocity with a grain of salt. Some of these guys are just ramping up and they're not going to be going all out. But that being said, if he's sitting more 93, 94 than 91, 92, I think that's something that's going to be worth monitoring going forward. 2 guys that I'm going to be just curious to watch for over the course of camp is Bryce Eldridge and Carson Whisenhunt, 2 of the Giants' top prospects. Eldridge, in particular, being the Giants' top prospect. He's probably not going to get a ton as far as in-game reps over the course of spring training. If he does, it'll probably be more in a mid-game substitution, or maybe he starts one of the split squad games. It's very unlikely that he's going to get maybe 30 at-bats over the course of spring training or whatever a regular starter's workload amounts to. But, it is an opportunity to see him against major league competition, and regardless of whether he's starting a game or if he's coming in against kind of the minor league pitchers, it's competition. And of course, just generally speaking, the fun part of spring training is just seeing how all these position battles play out and seeing who gets hot, see who has their stock really increase, see who kind of comes out of nowhere. And these are things that we can't really predict until the games themselves play out, which I don't think the first game. We still have 11 days from today until the first games play out, which feels like a million years from now, but it's going to be here before you know it. And then once these games kick off, we'll have something new to talk about. We'll have some actual data to dip into. And just for me personally, this is going to be my first spring training covering the Giants, my first spring training in Arizona. The previous 2 spring trainings that I did when covering the Pittsburgh Pirates were in Bradenton, Florida, and no shade to Bradenton or Florida as well. I can throw a little bit of shade in Florida for a variety of other reasons. But my biggest gripe with the Grapefruit League is that everybody's so far apart. Like, the only team within like a regular commute distance was the Orioles in Sarasota. But if they were playing the Phillies in, Clearwater, the Blue Jays in Dunedin, the Yankees in Tampa, like, that's an hour north. And when I'm coming back, it's during rush hour. So I'm excited for spring training, everything to be close, everything to be condensed, and just kind of selfishly knowing that all of my kind of friends are going to be in a more condensed region as well. They're going to be within reach, where compared to Florida, it feels like everyone was just so far away at all times. But regardless, we're going to have a lot to talk about over these coming weeks. It's going to be fun. Talk to y'all then.